So I first of all want to just thank the folks at Advanced Illinois for organizing this. I don't know how many of you heard that we are really doing a tour of the state, 4 meetings in 36 hours, and you are number 3 out of 4. So I appreciate the opportunity. In my position at Student Achievement Partners, I speak quite a bit, and it is just nice to know that kind of coming to the Chicago area, that I will have the opportunity to speak to supporters of education, parents who have children in the school systems, educators, and I understand you are a leading bunch here in this room, and then this evening meeting with some legislators. So this is a good example, and certainly when I look at the fact that 15 organizations are sponsoring this event, it should make us all feel good that there is some real energy and some real synergy behind this pretty challenging task ahead of us in understanding and implementing the Common Core. So let's get to the actual presentation. So just a little bit about the organization that I work for, because I think particularly for a gathering of educators, hearing this first will help you kind of listen to everything else in perhaps a different way going forward this morning. So Student Achievement Partners was formed by 3 of the leading writers of the standards themselves. So David Coleman in literacy, who is now president and CEO of the College Board, Jason Zimba in mathematics, and Sue Pimentel also in literacy. And at least in New Jersey, I was working at the State Department of Education during the adoption consideration process. And we always seem to, in New Jersey, have conspiracy theories, wonderings about what this initiative is really about. And the going conspiracy theory about the Common Core was that, I know what's going to happen. These little brainiacs out there are going to write these standards, and then they are going to sell every PD kit, every textbook series, curriculum, tools, whatever it's going to take to actually make this happen, they'll sell because they've just convinced all of these states to, in fact, adopt the standards. And I can tell you, with a distinct set of pride, that nothing could be further from the truth. So from the minute that they formed Student Achievement Partners as an organization, decided that it should be a nonprofit, and that access to information and tools to support the implementation of the Common Core must be this nation's greatest public good. So you can see up here the 3 principles under which we operate. We hold no intellectual property. Very different than we have no ideas, because we have plenty of those. But we don't sell them. We are working really hard, particularly in this current calendar year, in the development of tools, resources. You'll see at the bottom of the slides, our website is achievethecore.org. We just relaunched yesterday, so if you have been to that website previous, you're going to want to check it out again, because there's a whole additional suite of tools available. There's no stock photos, no flash video. It is really just tools, and we are very much working in partnership with educators throughout the country in helping to determine what tools are most useful, how they are useful, how teachers and school leaders are doing this work, so that we can be absolutely supportive. Second of all, we do not compete for any district, state, or federal contracts. We don't want to kind of be the winners in any of those races. Rather, we work with organizations in helping them shape their RFPs, their contracts, where they're asking for things, so that the marketplace itself can get better. And the third of our kind of operating principles is that we do not take money from publishers. We talk to them all the time. We tell them what good should look like, but we don't take money for endorsements. We critique, we compliment at will. Nobody owns our thoughts. And so this makes a huge difference in the world, where I am sure you are all aware of how many people are eager to sell you something to help you with this work of the Common Core. And so that is not us. We don't take honoraria for speaking. One of the reasons why I travel so much is because we don't charge, and we actually know a lot about the standards. So hopefully through this time that we have together this morning, we will get to a degree of specificity about what this work is, some good places to start. I really look forward to the Q&A session, because I'm sure many of you can kind of have heard different pieces of rumors, different ideas about what this is and what this isn't, and hopefully you'll leave here today with some confidence. And so before we begin, I will just ask you all It's kind of a teacher request to be active listeners. Don't just think that I am here to entertain you, but I actually want you to do work as a result of this. So think about how these comments, how these descriptions of the standards might actually impact decisions that you make every day in the next couple years that we have ahead of us, where we are all working so hard at this work. So one of the things, as I do talk quite frequently about this topic, there's all kinds of different responses. Everything from people who have not even heard about the Common Core or what it is, to people who say, oh, yeah, we did that last year. We're done. We got it. Of those two kind of distinct areas, ends of the spectrum, the people who say they've already got it worry me more than the people who are saying they've never heard of this. Those are the people who typically don't quite understand the scope of this work. And I'll admit a sense of guilt that when we were going through the whole adoption process, the typical language surrounding consideration of the adoption of the Common Core was, hey, listen, it's not that much different than what we're doing now. It's based on the best work we've been doing for a while. And now we are here in implementation and we're telling you, actually, this is hard. Actually, this is a significant shift from current typical practice. And so that was, a bit of a refinement of the message, but certainly we need to get down to the nitty-gritty and actually making this work happen. And so it is true that in this country, we have operated in a standards environment for about 20 years now or so. And this is different than that. So what the typical response of those who say we're already there is what one of my colleagues in Tennessee refers to as the great binder replacement. We took the Illinois state standards off the shelf. We put these standards on the shelf. Instead of numbers before letters, we have letters before numbers, and it's just a new tagging system. In fact, a bit of work that I did over the last year was working with Race to the Top states with the U.S. Department of Education, talking to them about the standards. And interestingly, one of the things that the U.S. Department of Education did is they used to survey these states fairly frequently about what their needs were in implementation of all the reforms. And they actually told me that they rated instructional leadership as the lowest priority, the least urgent and the least impactful thing that had to happen in order to implement the reforms. And when they were sharing this information with me, I, started questioning everything I believed about education. I said, are you kidding me? How could they possibly have said that? What could have possibly caused them to think that instructional leadership was so unimportant in this work? And then they asked me to do a presentation about the standards themselves, and I did my little show, which you're about to experience. And the next month, they gave another survey, same kind of questions, and instructional leadership became #1 thing. And that really spoke to this idea that this is more than just a desk audit that we're talking about. This isn't just a gap analysis of a curriculum. Fourth grade fractions were here, and now they're here, and we're just kind of shuffling the cards around. This is a change in approach to standards instruction. And so while we've had standards for a couple of decades now, what we typically have not had in many of our school systems is standards-based instruction. So if I were to describe kind of my idea of the difference between those two things, in a world where we just have standards alignment, a teacher looks at their curriculum, maybe, and thinks about what he or she wants to teach, plans out the lesson, the student learning objectives and all of that, and then kind of as a last thing looks through the standards and says, which one can I hook this to? And it's kind of like the last thing that you do. Very different from standards-based instruction, where the concept is that we know what the standards are. These represent expectations that we hold for all of our students in that particular grade. And my job as a teacher is to figure out how many ways I need to present this material to my students. My students need to experience these understandings so that by the end of the year, all of my kids reach these standards. And so it is true that these are minimum expectations. I mean, it's kind of interesting to say that when we talk about raising expectations. This is the new minimum. It is not intended to be a maximum, but it is in fact intended to drive instruction rather than just a secondary thought of what we're aligning to. And why we can start having this conversation now, and perhaps why it didn't happen in the previous era of standards beforehand, had a lot to do with those standards themselves. And so most of us are aware that typical state standards that preceded the Common Core were excessively long. So someone once did an analysis of the California state standards and said, if a teacher decided to teach all the standards in California, it would take 33 years. I imagine, my own state of New Jersey, probably similar. I'm sure similar in Illinois as well. So by design, you can't start off your school year saying, okay, what's on my plate? What is my agenda to teach this year? You right away have to make some choices. Within that long list of standards, another problem that we had is that many of the standards were very vague. So my favorite example that I often use is in New Jersey, we had a 3rd grade standard that said, students will explore concepts of fractions. Like, okay, we'll have a pizza party today. Great, done, standards aligned lesson. And they don't really give you the information about, so what would that look like on an assessment item? What would that look like in performance? And so when you think about vague statements, they don't really help drive instruction either. Assessments tend to be not good drivers either, because they are typically sampling. We don't want to, make the tests last weeks and weeks long. So we have, 117 math goals this year. There certainly aren't 117 questions on our state assessments. How can we make decisions about which things get kind of real estate on our assessments? We've typically done, whether you call it roulette or whatever, just kind of random decisions, maybe a bit better than that, but not much in what gets on our assessments. So the result of all of this is that when we look at standards instructions before Common Core, it has typically been a teacher-focused conversation. What did the teacher present? What was the pacing chart? Where was the lesson plans that showed that you actually paid attention to this? Very different from a truly standards-based instructional program where your question, front and center, is, did the students learn? And when we have kind of this huge breakneck pace of instruction, we can't even have that question of, did the students learn? The idea is, how much did you cover? What did you get through? And so this is really where all of these changes are coming from, this idea of going from standards-aligned instruction to standards-based instruction with a set of standards that we present before you. So one thing that I'll just kind of put out there, and I think it's very important, is that this isn't just like an idea that we just all as educators kind of woke up with, saying, you know what we should do? We should prepare our kids. Like, that's a good idea. Why didn't somebody tell me that before? So this comes after a lot of hard work, a lot of good intention, and so it is typical that when I speak to groups of educators that they are very eager to tell me everything they've been doing. We have extended learning days and tutoring programs and mentoring programs, and here's our PD program, and teachers coming for the summer to do this, and all I'm asking them is, of all of that you're doing, what's working? And that tends to be a pretty disarming question in education circles because we don't take the time to look at the results of our work. So we have implemented standards for over 20 years in this country, but they themselves, the existence of those standards did not do much to make impact on student achievement. When we look at all of that hard work, we continue to have significant gaps in achievement, as well as significant gaps in expectations. So for example, in my state of New Jersey, when we start off with a set of standards that are way too long, I know from talking to students, talking to parents, looking at what's going on in the schools, that there are some schools in New Jersey that work on this set of standards. There are other schools in New Jersey that have their kids working at this set of standards. They're both working on the standards, but we continue, even though the whole purpose of standards was to say, what we continue to say now, shouldn't matter what your zip code is, when you have a list of standards too long, we continue to have those kinds of gaps. Despite doubling or even tripling the investment in education over the past 40 years, despite a significant decrease in class size over 40 years, a significant infusion of research-based practice over 40 years, we have another indicator of data, which is our National Assessment of Education Progress. And over 40 years, even though lots and lots of people can tell me how hard they've been working and all of the things that have been going on, when we look at this data over 40 years, in 4th grade literacy, we see a slight uptick in performance over 40 years, we do. In 8th grade, 40 years, results are as flat as can be. And in the limited administration that we give on the NAEP assessment in high school, over 40 years, we are actually seeing a decline in performance. So we can all feel good about how hard we're all working, but this is the real deal. This is the data that is showing us, what's actually happening. We can take a look at the most recent ACT data, which is supposed to be what kids are, preparing for. College and career readiness, that's what we're doing. And of the students just last year nationally that took the ACT, and I know you have some Illinois-specific data, 28% of test takers did not meet the college readiness benchmark in anything. And so I'm always reminded, looking at this from a national perspective, this doesn't count our dropouts. This typically counts kids who are at least intending to go to college or thinking that might be a possibility. It's pretty sobering. And as we all kind of rally the troops around every kid going to college, we have sobering data about remediation rates. So how many of our students graduate, earn a diploma, get credits, pass their courses, enter a college, only to find out that they do not have the knowledge and skills that will even earn them into a credit-bearing course. And so it's one thing to send a kid to college, but quite a different thing to prepare them to be successful in college. And so that's really kind of the rallying cry that kind of reminds us that it's not enough just to work hard. We really need to figure out what it is that we should be working at. So what makes these standards different is that it literally started with kind of 3, albeit admittedly subjective descriptions of the standards. And so there are a lot of mathematicians, particularly out there in the world, who always tell me I shouldn't describe the standards this way. I think it's helpful. First of all, in order for standards to drive instruction, they had to be fewer in number. So when I worked at the State Department in New Jersey, if I ever had a convening like this, typically about a month and a half before, I'd say, okay, am I going to give people a copy of the standards? Like, do I have enough money in my budget to order that really big paper, figure out which printer in the department is able to handle that really big paper, and just the sheer volume of the document, communicated significantly. And when we were going through the standards, adoption consideration in our state, I remember, going to a meeting with a group of teachers and saying, okay, I'm going to give them a grade level of standards in math. And it literally fit on one piece of paper, 8.5 by 11, not even the big paper, just the regular paper, both sides, no margins and 6-point font, but it did all fit on one piece of paper. And that's significant. I mean, as a teacher, that is significant. When you can say, I can hold and sit down and look at all of the expectations that my kids have for this year, that is significant. And that these standards are so few that they are in fact expected for all students is a significant change from these voluminous documents of standards that preceded them. The second description is that these standards are clear. Again, another subjective term, because Illinois, I'm sure like most other states, had a particular language for how you describe math, how you describe literacy. I know in New Jersey, we right away had to change from calling it language arts literacy, no, English language arts to language arts literacy, and that was the first horror that we had to deal with, a change in language. But when we say these standards are clearer, it doesn't mean they're easy to read. They're certainly pretty detailed and in some cases quite challenging. But when you read them, it right away gives you a sense of what the performance should look like. I promise you won't see a standard that says explore concepts with fractions. Like, what does it look like when a kid's proficient in exploring concepts with fractions? Who knows, right? It's not really that kind of a statement. And so that's what we mean by a set of standards that are clearer. And the third significant thing to know about these standards and description is that they are higher. Notice I didn't say they're harder. I said they're higher. So we're not talking about a set of standards that is requiring our second graders to solve calculus equations and to read War and Peace. That would be harder stupid, but harder. And these are, in fact, a set of standards that are higher. So let's all remind ourselves that education didn't invent the concept of having standards. There are many industries out there that have standards. And can you imagine going to Home Depot, whatever, buying an appliance, and it said, meet standards, safety standards. And you think, some of the standards, some of the time, most of the time. What it in fact means to have high standards is when it is expected, when it is declared, it is in fact expected. So in the 3rd grade in math again, we have a standard in the Common Core that says students will be able to fluently multiply within 100. It's in there. It's a high standard because the expectation isn't the top 25% of students will be able to do that. Isn't the students that come from, 2-parent homes, college degreed, will do that. It's a high standard because these standards are built on the idea that all kids will get there. In making decisions about at which grade level to put things in, we didn't just decide, let's start everything earlier, let's make our kindergartners do more hard work in kindergarten. That wasn't the idea at all. It was how can we build a staircase of progressive expectations so that by the time kids graduate high school, they will have the knowledge and skills necessary to be successful in whatever they choose to do afterwards. And so the way that we got to fewer, clearer, higher standards is to do something that we all too often don't do in education, which is to start off with the evidence. In order to get to fewer standards, we needed to do more than just have, the typical, I know at least the way we used to develop standards in New Jersey. You bring together stakeholder groups, people who you like and people who speak to the press, and you ask them to kind of have conversations about, so what do you think should be in the standards? And what do you think should be in the standards? What's your experience tell you? What kind of platform lobbying perspective are you going to take? And listen, we only have until 3 o'clock today, so okay, I'll give you what you want, you get what you want, and we just kind of grew these documents. A colleague of mine used to call this democracy gone amok. Everybody just gets their thing in there, and it was never with the idea of what do kids really need? How do we know they really need that? So these standards started with this idea of taking a look at international standards, taking a look at what's actually being expected in technical programs, trade schools, apprenticeships, 2-year colleges, 4-year colleges. And in order to make decisions about what needed to be cut out, we had to look at the evidence. So let me just say that it's not to say that things that are no longer in the standards are evil. It's not to say that those things are going to rot the brains of our students. But it's to say we adopted the Common Core. We typically did not give you all more money or more time. So how can we finally be adult about this and say, yes, there are some things that matter more than others. And those are the things that we need to signal to teachers, to kids, to parents, that we really need to be focusing on and investing in. It shouldn't be seen as a limitation, particularly if you're in a high-performing district, but there should be a signal that these are the things that matter. And if you are a teacher in a classroom where kids are struggling on these things, it means something very different than if kids are struggling on something that you happen to integrate into your program that's not in the standards. These are the things that matter most for kids. And then the third bullet up here, I just want to highlight for all of you, because this is kind of this rare moment in time. I don't know how many of you have ever experienced this. I think this is my first time experiencing this, where we start an initiative in education by saying the first thing to do is decide what you're going to stop doing. Not here's one more thing to do, as if we weren't already maxed out with time and initiatives. But the first step in Common Core implementation is to decide how you are going to make time and space in your work in order to get this to happen. So there were all kinds of ideas that people submitted when we went through all the teacher feedback processes and so on about, well, what about this concept in math and what about this concept in literacy? Isn't that good and important? And every time those comments were considered, the idea was, is it important enough to take time away from the things that were already in the standards? And if it was, then it got included. And if it wasn't, we kept it out. And so these are a set of standards that are probably for the first time in consideration of honesty about time. But I will tell you that with the numerous kind of groups that are doing research on the implementation of these standards, as much as we've been begging for this message, like let's start with the power of the eraser before the power of the pen, teachers and schools are completely resistant to this notion of stopping certain things. And I can guess why. I mean, there are a group of us who think this is going to go away, and if I throw out that project, it'll just come back again. You know, there are people who think, you know, it's on a test somewhere, our kids have to get that. Or probably most relevant, we just don't have enough resources in the things that we're to be focusing on that we don't know how we're going to fill the time if you're telling me to cut all that other stuff out of my curriculum. So this is a huge challenge, and we'll continue to talk about this idea of focus and being honest about time. So as we talk about the standards, let me just be clear, you know, well aware of kind of the grumblings going on around the country about Common Core. If you didn't hear, the RNC passed a resolution last week against the Common Core, and I read it. I said, they haven't been to one of my workshops. I would have set them straight. Because this idea of Common Core dictating instruction, some kind of an idea of a one-size-fits-all model for a national curriculum, is absolutely against what Common Core stands for. When I tell you, for example, all kids can fluently multiply within 100 by the end of 3rd grade, I am sure of the 380 plus people here, we can come up with at least 200 different ways to get kids there. And that is really the power of innovative practice and everything that I really want you to be thinking about as quite a significant opportunity that we have with Common Core. And so as we talk about what the standards are and what they are not, nor have they ever been curriculum, but they certainly do have implications not only on what we teach, but on how we teach. Because if the idea of all of your kids being able to fluently multiply within 100 by the end of 3rd grade doesn't make you think, wow, I'd really better get good at differentiation, scaffolding, multiple supports. There are a lot of PD needs there, huge implications on how to teach, then you're not quite getting the message either. So this doesn't dictate how we teach, but certainly has implications about the needs that we all have as professionals in supporting teachers in this work. So finally, the last thing that I would say about this before we dive into the specifics of the content, I don't even like to talk about this initiative as implementing the standards. It's not really quite big enough and descriptive enough to talk about the significance of the work that we're doing here. The significance of the work of implementing the Common Core state standards is that we are actually working to create an education system in this country that believes and supports the idea that all kids graduate ready for college and careers. It is not everything. It is not the magic thing that has to happen and bam, we're there. But it certainly does create conditions to make this possible. And so that is really the thing to talk to parents about. That is really the thing to talk to teachers in your districts about. This idea that this is more than just taking the Illinois standards off, putting the Common Core state standards in, and interesting that 44 other states are doing the same thing. But this is really about how can we focus our work on this idea that this is a K-12 system of education that's working toward a goal of not keeping the kids occupied for 13 years, not having, these interesting, little blurbs of memories, but really working hard at things that have meaning for kids and will actually also have utility for kids. So that being said, this isn't kind of a factory model. It's not a drill. It's not a group of widgets going through yet another factory line process. Because when we get to this idea of focus and depth, it's a much richer experience. But it really does change our focus. Right now we have quite a disconnected system, and when we talk about some of these specifics, we'll talk about what some of these disconnects are, but this is really what this work is about. So as we talk about, what is different about the Common Core? We at Student Achievement Partners have kind of come up with this framing, and you have more documentation there. It is really kind of the pervasive way that we talk about the standards. So from the people who toiled over every punctuation mark, every phrase within the standards themselves, they would be the first to tell you, if you really want to understand the Common Core state standards, you need to first understand the forest from the trees. You need to get a sense of these big picture messages. And when we talk about this, my expectation of all of you is that when we leave here in 2.5 hours, you know this. You just will know it. And so I challenge you to think through each of these shifts, if you will, and so that if I stopped you at the bathroom break or on your way to the car, I can ask you these and you will know them. I have faith that you'll be able to do that. But that's this idea. It's not, what are the standards? It is a very clear description of the big things that are changing. It is not everything in the standards. If you know this stuff, you don't know everything, but these are great places to start and a great way to talk to various stakeholders about the standards themselves. So in English language arts and literacy, the first big change is this idea of what students are reading typically. So we know from our research and going all over the place across the country that we have had an incredible expansion of the literacy block in our elementary schools. Blame it on NCLB, whatever it might be. It probably is the reason why we see a slight uptick in 4th grade NAEP performance, but typically we have these 90-minute blocks for literacy that are probably the most sacred bits of time in all of education. A raise of hands of how many of you work in an elementary school that have literacy blocks? Okay, pretty good. In my daughter, I have 2 daughters who are in 4th and 2nd grade. And we are not allowed to have early dismissals during the literacy block, no doctor's appointments in the literacy block, and in some cases, kids cannot even use the restroom during the literacy block. It is like the most sacred bit of time. But the interesting thing that we also found with our research is that about 80% of what kids are reading in the literacy block is stories, fiction. And as a former science teacher, as a daughter of a 3rd grade teacher, my mother is still in the classroom, I am reminded all of the time about what has happened to science and social studies instruction in our elementary schools in particular as a result, really, of this expanded time. Is that although we have 90 minutes of sacred time every day for literacy, typically we see things like, okay, and we'll teach social studies every Thursday for 4 weeks. And then we'll teach science every Thursday. And if we have an assembly, you can bet it's not during the literacy block, it's during the social studies and science time that we do that. And if I think about the minds of our young learners coming into elementary school, what better time for them to learn about the world around them than at those ages? So this first shift is saying that what we need to think about is a rebalance of what kids are reading. So are you ready for this clarification? In elementary school, about half of what students are reading should be nonfiction, which means half of what they're reading remains fiction. So it's a balance, 50-50. But it's not just the fact that they have experiences with nonfiction text. So I've talked to many school leaders who say, oh, we've been doing that. Time for Kids, Weekly Reader, we're there. Turns out you really don't build students' knowledge through those kinds of nonfiction texts. And the way you actually build students' knowledge through nonfiction is that you consider a topic, not a theme, but a topic of instruction, science, social studies, whatever it might be, government, bats, dinosaurs, butterflies. And students read a series of text selections about a topic, and as they read more about it, not only are they getting smarter, more knowledgeable about the topic, but their ability to read also increases as the text itself gets more dense with information. So this is the idea of the first shift for elementary schools, about 50-50. Now notice that these are not a set of standards that are just English language arts standards. These standards also include literacy because they are built on college and career readiness, and it turns out there's more than just English language arts we need to think about, but literacy in science and technical subjects and in history and social studies. If you ever want to get anybody at my organization really upset, you say to them, wasn't that an appendix? No. Those are part of the standards that your state adopted, literacy in science, literacy in history and social studies. So what happens in the middle school is that the social studies and science teachers, as well as in the high school, should start using text more than just as an outside reference, but really as a source of information. So I don't know how many of you have kind of gone through a series of professional experiences, but now when I think about all the steps I've taken, God, I'd be a really good science teacher right now. I've learned so much since I've left the classroom that I would really do that job really well. And so if I think back to whether or not in my high school science class, did I use a textbook? Absolutely I did. I assigned my kids to read the chapters, answer the questions at the end of the passages, and when they would come into school the next day, you can already probably imagine what I did. I told them everything it was that they had just read. You know, I checked their answers, and if they had a question about what they read, I was all too eager to give them the answer to that question. And I can honestly say I don't remember ever telling them, well, where did you find that in your textbook? Can we look at the text together and actually use that as a source of information? So that is the move in middle school social studies and science, high school social studies and science, is that students are also building knowledge from the text that they're reading. Not just reading text as kind of a support to a lecture, a support to what teachers are telling them, but really as a source of information. So we've talked for decades also about, every teacher's a reading teacher, literacy across the content areas. This is actually something quite different, because I think the way we've typically presented this in the past is, listen, we have a state assessment, and it includes math, and it includes reading. So do your friends in the English department a favor, and do some writing in your class. Do some reading in your class. But never was it necessarily presented in my experience as, you want your kids to get better at science? They need to know how to read science closely, find information from that text in order to actually enhance their content knowledge. And it's just really interesting because it's happened to me, and thank goodness I have the armor of having been a science teacher, where somebody in the science department will come up to me and say, and are you telling the English teachers to teach science? Because I didn't go to college to teach kids how to read. And I will tell you that typical high school English teachers did not go to college to teach high school kids how to read either. They went to college to teach about literature. That's what they want to teach about. And so this notion of reading closely, making sense of text and all of that is a new thing for them as well. So when we talk about this idea of literacy across the content areas, it should not be seen as a distraction from the content that we already have. It is just a different idea. So when we're talking about what kids are reading in science and social studies classes, it includes, in history, you have the text, but you also have primary source documents and so on. In science, you have the text, but you also have other sources of information that you could be reading. And in the standards themselves, we have descriptions of the standards specific to the content areas in 612, so that when we talk about 50-50 nonfiction and fiction in elementary schools, by the time they get through high school, it's closer to about 30% fiction and 70% nonfiction. But let me just be clear. In the English class, the primary type of reading that they are doing remains fiction. So this is a huge misconception. I mean, we've written, posts, we've written as much as we can. It is in the standards itself clearly stated that this is not about losing the American classics. This is not about forgetting all those things that we've been reading for years in the English class. The big shift here is much more literacy in the content areas and some nonfiction in the English class, but remaining very committed to the very important role of literature in the English class. There is a lot of misinformation out there, and this is one that I want to make sure that you guys are all clear with. Okay, second, probably the most amusing of the three shifts, is this idea that in response to text, students should have to use evidence from the text. So we often kind of tag this as, I have to get it right because I've been saying this so much lately, reading like a detective and writing like a reporter. So when students are reading, they need to be looking for evidence, and when they are responding to text, they need to use that evidence. And believe it or not, also, this is very atypical from what we often see happening in schools. So here are some examples of the typical and the contrast. So typically, students at the upper elementary school, lower middle school read Casey at the bat. And a very typical question that students would answer in response to that text is, describe a time when you failed at something. And if any of us in this room had ever failed at anything, Whether or not we read that text, I guarantee we could all write that essay right now. Agree? Very different than what makes Casey's experiences at the bat humorous. Like, you actually have to have that text in hand, use evidence from the text to make a case about that. Probably a more obvious example as far as how typical it is, students read Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. The essay that they write in response to that. Discuss in writing a time when you wanted to fight against something that was unfair. What kid wouldn't write about that? What teacher wouldn't enjoy reading about that? Turns out, that's not really college and career readiness. Because I don't know about how many of you get that kind of question in your adult life or in your college life. Like, just describe a time when, you thought we should have school uniforms. My daughter is in 4th grade this year, and it's not going really well. I was anonymous in my district until this year. And she brought home an essay where the prompt was, use evidence to describe whether or not you think animals have feelings. Evidence, what? Nothing to read, no conversation. Like, that was the essay. Do animals have feelings or not? We do this all the time. It's on many of our state assessments. New Jersey was pretty famous this year for some of the crazy questions we had on our tests, but typically it's things like, describe your favorite day, do you think there should be a garbage dump across the street? Those kinds of things are not college and career ready writing. College and career ready writing looks more like using evidence to make a point. Now, I should say, just to hopefully kind of ease your minds a bit, these same shifts that we're talking about in literacy, the same shifts we're going to talk about in math, are built into the DNA of the PARCC assessments that are coming down the pike. It is absolutely critical to our work as Student Achievement Partners that we make seamless. The idea of implementing the standards is the work of preparing for these assessments. It is not a choice, it is the same thing. So when you take a look at the first shift, which you all remember already, even if you're not looking up there, is nonfiction. The reading passages that students will be presented with, I promise you, are not all going to be literature, not all going to be fiction. There will be science passages, social studies passages, as well as fiction. And when it comes to this second shift of using evidence, I promise you that there are not going to be essays out there that are disconnected from content. Describe your favorite superhero. They will actually ask students to answer a question after reading a passage and highlight, cut and paste, because it's all going to be online, where you got that answer from the text. This second shift of using evidence in response to a text, if I was a school leader, great place to start this work. Why? Because you can use evidence in responding to text kindergarten through 12th grade. Kids are sitting around the carpet reading a story out loud, and teacher asks them questions. Yeah, how did you know that? What in the story let you believe that answer? You can do it in science classes, social studies classes, across the curriculum, and it's just a really great way to start this work. Another, my favorite example, and you can guess why, because it comes from a biology textbook, but also because a participant in one of my workshops gave this to me, kind of having heard about the shifts. This is an excerpt from James Watson's memoir. It comes from a biology textbook. So they excerpt it apart and put it in the textbook, which all sounds like great, right? Really promising. When I started working at Student Achievement Partners, David Coleman asked me to read these memoirs, and I will tell you, it was with a sense of guilt that I read these memoirs and said, wow, for the years that I taught biology, I told kids about the discovery of DNA when they actually could have read it in the words of the scientists themselves. Like, that would have been quite a different experience for kids. So I was really, satisfied that this textbook company decided to put this excerpt in the text, and then you look at the prompt that students have to answer in response. James Watson used time away from his lab and a set of models similar to preschool toys to help him solve the puzzle of DNA. In an essay, discuss how play and relaxation help promote clear thinking and problem solving. I promise you that's not what this is about. We don't need to read this in order to get that. And I probably can also promise you that there isn't a biology teacher in the world who thinks that's worth the time out from teaching science to do this reading. They could have, in fact, instead asked to compare and contrast the different ideas that were being, discussed, debated, who believed in what the differences were in each of the models. There's some really rich science here. This prompt doesn't ask kids to do that. So it is true that there is a part of me that is very nerdy by design. And I can imagine students who go through the work of, in fact, understanding a text, figuring it out, figuring out what it means, and then the prompt that they answer in response to that text doesn't reward them for doing that hard work. Pretty soon kids figure out, really, I read King's Letter from a Birmingham jail and all I have to write about is something that was unfair? Why did I spend all that time? Why did I spend all that energy? There's no payoff. The teacher's not even going to know whether or not I understood. And so that's a problem that we want to make sure that we take care of in this. The third of the 3 shifts in literacy, I am going to kind of, in my estimation, declare as probably the one that will be the most challenging for teachers in the classroom. And so in the research that informed the standards, what we found is that one of the reasons why we see so many kids entering into remedial programs after high school, not being able to pass minimum basic skills tests in apprenticeships and trade programs, technical schools, is because what they are reading in high school typically is as much as 4 grade levels below what they typically have to read in those post-secondary settings. So if you can imagine your 4th graders having to read 8th grade text, probably without a teacher there, that's pretty much the challenge that most of our kids have had. So it was quite a discussion and a debate during the process of drafting these standards that we not only pay attention to the skills of English language arts and literacy, but always in consideration of what it was that students were actually reading. So the fact that you and I can identify the main idea in a text means very little if I can only do it with, Dick and Jane readers, and you can do it with more complex texts like, whatever, War and Peace and so on. And so what these standards have within them is grade by grade. You can imagine a step-by-step ladder of text complexity expectations so that by the time students graduate high school, they are very close to reading what they need to be reading once they graduate. Very different from a very typical practice that exists now, where you go into an early elementary classroom and kids come to us with all different reading abilities, and we give them all different things to read. And so if you are a struggling reader, it's probably because you have a shallow vocabulary and you cannot comprehend more complex sentence structures. So what we do is we give you texts absent of vocabulary and absent of complex sentence structures. And it turns out that it doesn't get you caught up at all. And so what this shift is saying is that in the precious time that we have with direct instruction, we need kids to get increasingly independent with increasingly complex text. So we're not saying in September, throw every kid an on-grade level text. But the goal should be that we do things as teachers with these kids that get them to on-grade level text. And it turns out the best way to learn how to read complex text is to read complex text. My kids laugh at me when they bring home their homework and I say, oh, you have to spell? You know how you learn how to spell? You spell. So this is the practice. Now, that being said, this doesn't take care of everything. So there are still the foundational skills of reading. We still want kids to build fluency. Very hard to build fluency in reading if you're always reading things that are hard for you. So in their independent reading time, they should still be reading things that are close to their level of development with reading. But in the precious time for instruction, we need to figure out how to scaffold and bring kids in to on-grade level text. Because by the way, the text that they're going to have on these assessments is going to be on-grade level text. So how we give kids the skills of figuring out word meanings, figuring out which words that you really need to pay attention to, which words it's okay not to pay so much attention to, exposure with complex text is really what this third shift is about. It's really what we thought we were doing a good job of avoiding in the last, probably decade or so, where we did scaffold by replacing texts. And so this, if I were going to identify the biggest PD need, I would say it's with this, particularly in elementary schools. So just to give you another idea about complex texts, as you get to high school, it's going to be pretty hard to find on grade level fiction. So it might be the reason why in English classes you might have to do some nonfiction, because it pretty much tops out. When kids, even in high school, pick their own texts to read, their own fictional texts to read, research tells us that it pretty much tops out at a 5th grade level. So we have to encourage students to read more complex texts. It can't just be reading things of topical interest to them. So when we talk about text complexity, it's made up of these 3 features of text. So there's the quantitative measures of text complexity, the things that a computer could basically tell you, sentence length, vocabulary, that kind of stuff. But there's also qualitative. And so on our website, we have all kinds of resources about rubrics for judging complexity and the things that you take a look at in making these judgments. And it's actually a very good activity for teachers to work on, is going through the process of understanding issues of text complexity and making judgments about what they're reading. Now, I will tell you a very interesting thing that you will find on our website. We also knew that, as I said, not everybody got money when they adopted the Common Core, if anybody got money when they adopted the Common Core. And so we knew when we looked at what kids were typically reading across the country that there are still a lot of kids reading within basal programs and so on. And when we looked at that, what we realized is that the texts within those programs aren't so bad. But what really was off point were the questions that students were asked to answer in response to those texts. So in a partnership that we have with the Council of Great City Schools, we gathered hundreds of teachers together and really helped them understand how to develop good text-dependent questions. And what we did is we literally took 5 of the most widely used basal readers, and there's so much overlap with the texts within them, and we just rewrote the questions with these teachers, go through a very significant review process, and we posted them all up on our website. Free to use. We have over 16,000 teachers subscribed into this right now. It's for grades 3 through 5, and so if you are in a school that has those grade levels, even if you're not using a basal program, I would encourage you to take a look at those questions because it gives you a further flavor of what these questions should be about. There's also a new set up there that emphasizes writing more. And just last month, we kicked off a grade 6 through 10 anthology alignment project. So teachers got together and said, hey, here's what my kids are reading. Can you help me just write better questions on this same text? And that also will be on our website, the questions posted for everyone to use for free, of course. So that's a resource that you can use when you're focusing your work on questions. Okay, let's talk about math now. When we talk about literacy, anybody want to kind of say what's one of the shifts that you can think about in literacy? We're moving on, but just to make sure you still have it. Any words come to mind? Complex text, nonfiction, evidence. Okay, I'll trust you. I trust you. We have 3 of them. When the people from our literacy team present them, I think they usually do them in a 3-2-1 order. Doesn't really matter. You know, depending on your situation, you might try to focus on one of those shifts first, all 3 of them together. Kind of up to you. That is not the case in math. In math, you must start with the first shift, which is focus. So I'm sure most of you have been in this business long enough that you've at least heard of the expression that our math curriculum in this country is a mile wide and an inch deep. One of the teachers who we work closely with, who's a 4th grade teacher in Connecticut, calls it spray and pray. We just kind of give the kids all this math information and pray that some of it will stick. And oftentimes I'm asked to kind of compare literacy to math. What about literacy is the same in math? And usually I'm pretty hesitant to do that. But if I think about the move in literacy of when a kid is a struggling reader, we just give them something easier to read. The equivalent in math is that when a kid is struggling in a math topic, we typically tell them to hold their breath until Monday because we're doing something brand new. We don't have time in our curriculum to really build this sense of understanding and confidence, and nothing could reinforce this more for me than watching the math curriculum for my own 2 daughters and how that works. Like starting at the earliest of grades, where we start by telling kids, this is tricky, This is hard. You know, let me show you some strategies from the get-go. And so the idea here is that what we want to see happen in the math standards is focus, and the standards themselves are focus. So this is a picture. You don't really have to make too much sense of it other than to see the shape. And so on the left, what you'll see is the analysis of math curriculum in the high-performing countries. And you'll see there's a very significant shape to it. Each column represents a grade from 1 to 8, and each row represents a math topic. So in first grade, there are 3 squares. Second grade, there are 3 squares. And as kids age through the system, there's more and more, but also things come off. So if you look at that top row, things come off when you get up to the middle school age. Compare that to the picture on the right, which is 21 of the states in the United States. We teach every single thing every single year, whether or not the kids are ready. We just do it. That's our best effort. Another way of looking at this is what we call the shopping aisle approach. Again, I could give this talk in any of these states, and this is pretty much how we've organized math education in this country. Numbers and operations, patterns and algebra, geometry and measurement, data, statistics, and probability, every single year, K-12. If I ask K-2 teachers, of these things, which is the most important? Almost without fail, I've never had an exception yet where they tell me numbers and operations. So if you can imagine going to a grocery store and someone tells you the most important thing for you to buy is fresh fruits and vegetables, and you go to the produce department and you put that stuff in your cart, and then because there are other aisles, you go up and down every other aisle and you put other things and other things and other things in there, and you get to the checkout lane, and I look at your cart, it is very difficult to see that you knew what was the most important thing to put in your cart. And that's really how our curriculum is organized. We have all of this stuff with very little signaling of what's more important. You know, my daughter called me last night, "Oh, Mom, I got 100 on my math test." Great. Was it on Common Core stuff? Not really. Great. I have a lot of funny stories depending on how much time I have. My daughter, who's in 2nd grade, happens to be a bit of a rebel, as it turns out. And for a good week, she was telling me she didn't have any homework. Listen, Mom, Mrs. Hughes does not want our parents getting involved in our homework this week, so we are doing it at school. And I was an elementary school principal, so by about the 4th day, I sneaked a peek into that backpack, and sure enough, I found a pile of worksheets that were not done. And I called her over. I said, "Daniela, what are these worksheets?" And she looked at me and said, "Come on, Mom, is it even Common Core?" So I guess I do talk about work a bit. So that picture is very different from this picture. And so in the math standards, in the Common Core state standards, instead of having separate distinct aisles for math, we actually have a shape. We actually have a progression. So that it is true that in K2, we focus on numbers, we focus on operations. Now, let's all be clear that that doesn't mean every day is a worksheet, every day is a drill. It means really deep experiences, hands-on, applications, really experiencing the math so that kids get this idea of a strong foundation in math. So we can do more than just teach kids tricks, we can actually teach them math. And then as they progress, their concept of whole numbers grows not into a separate topic of math, fractions, but actually into an expansion of what they already know about numbers. And it turns out when you teach math, all of the rules of addition with whole numbers also apply to addition of fractions, because you know what the concept of addition means. So for example, I can right away tell you that order doesn't matter, and it doesn't matter with fractions either. It matters with subtraction with whole numbers, and it matters with subtraction with fractions. And we can kind of build on this idea, but we can't do any of this if we don't first figure out what we're going to take out of our curriculum. And so this is a hard thing. It's a hard thing for teachers. The same researcher who developed those charts about the international countries and the states in the United States has done a lot of research lately of all the states that are implementing the Common Core. And his research results say that of the teachers he interviewed, 90% said they've read the standards. Okay. 75% of the teachers who he interviewed said that they actually agree with the concepts of the Common Core state standards in math. But less than 25% of those teachers said that if there is a topic in their curriculum that is not in the standards, that they are willing to drop it. So in my own children's district, I was anonymous until this past summer. And I met with the math supervisor, and I just said, listen, I have nothing to sell you. Just want to talk to you about this work and how I can be helpful to you and so on. And it turns out, just like many of you say, you can't be a prophet in your own land. I can't be an expert in my district either. And so he told me that, kindergarten and first grade teachers met to take a look at the entire K-8 scope for math. And here was the list of the packet of additional worksheets, whatever it was, that they had to put in order to be aligned to the Common Core. And I looked at him and I said, and where is the other pile? I said, what other pile? The pile of the stuff you're taking out. Because really, that matters more than the other one. You can't talk about things like all kids if you don't make space and time in your curriculum. So a very common question in this regard is, what about those kids that we all have that are gifted? Those kids who get these major math concepts? The idea is not to give them a mile-wide, inch-deep curriculum at a faster pace, but to also give them the opportunity to go really deep in these foundational math concepts, solve really rich problems, and so on. So when we talk about what we are focusing on, in fact, in math, I will tell you, it's not kind of like this foreign stuff that came from another planet. I probably could have left this chart blank, and most of you and your teachers could have filled in what should be the major work of the grade at these grade bands. So what this means is that a good 70% of your time, your energy, your professional conversations, the workshops that teachers are experiencing are all about these topics. Proportional reasoning in 6th grade. Fractions 3rd through 5th grade. Very different from just kind of like that shopping aisle approach. Now let me just say something about the assessments. 70% of the items will come from these topics. So it used to be, I don't know the specifics of the Illinois assessment, but in typical assessments, we have that shopping aisle organization of our assessments as well. And we have kids who, might do horribly in numbers and operations, but get enough points from the other areas that they can still show up as proficient. I will tell you that by design, you can't get enough points on the PARCC assessment if you don't know these things. So as a teacher, there isn't that pressure to say, oh my God, I have to cover everything that's on this assessment, because if your kids can't do this stuff, they won't be able to pass the assessment. And that's by design. It supports this notion that we really need to focus. So the second thing, and again, can only happen when we first focus, is the idea that math is supposed to make sense. And the way that math makes sense is when we make linkages to what we're learning grade by grade and what we're learning within a grade. So when my daughter was in 3rd grade last year, I decided to give her the greatest gift that a mother could give a child, which was to require that she, in fact, knew her multiplication tables. I mean, I remember as a student and as a teacher, when you know that kid that knows their multiplication tables, you actually have a leg up over every other student who just still struggles over that very basic step of knowing multiplication facts. And we worked on it, and it turns out that with that kind of fluency, that kind of drill, that's all it is, it doesn't really take a lot of thought. When you work at it, it kind of happens. And so I remember her saying, oh, today we're starting division. And I literally can picture myself thinking, today's going to be the day it pays off. She's going to come off that bus so happy that she knows her multiplication facts, because if you know your multiplication facts, you pretty much already know division, right? And I remember her coming off the bus and saying, hey, we started division today. And so we had this problem, 45 divided by 5. And the teacher said, so you take 45, and you subtract 5, and you subtract 5, and you subtract 5, and you subtract 5. This is how textbooks are written, as repeated subtraction. Why? Because we can't be assured that every kid knew their multiplication facts. So instead of connecting division to what we had just been working on, multiplication, we teach it as a brand new topic. We can't assume anything. And that's very different from the math education that our kids will have with Common Core State Standards implementation. So this idea that we're always making these linkages. I'll show you an example in the standards. So this is a third grade example from data representation. And the first part of this statement is probably very typical to what you've been doing for years. Draw a scaled picture graph and a scaled bar graph to represent a data set with several categories. So we probably all have been doing that. You know, and we would grade kids on, did you label the axes and did you fill up to the right number? Done. But what makes this an example of coherence is this second part of the statement, which isn't an example, it's not in italics, it is part of this same expectation that students will then solve 1 and 2 step, how many more and how many less problems using information presented in the bar graph. So it's not enough to say how many red M&Ms, how many blue M&Ms, how many green M&Ms, and you make this beautiful chart that's all, you know, neat and title and all of that kind of stuff, but that you also then can use that to make comparisons between numbers, because then you are reinforcing the major work of the grade. So this is an example of this idea of building in coherence in the standards. And then the third of the 3 shifts in math, so we have focus, we have coherence, is this idea of rigor. And I guess it's dissecting one too many frogs in my life that I just don't really like that word rigor. But what we mean about rigor is what does it mean to actually be proficient in math? And it turns out in a lot of our math programs in this country, we really have presented it as a choice. That we either go for conceptual understanding or we go for accurate answers, procedural skill and fluency, one or the other. So typically the programs that really promote conceptual understanding are some of these spiral programs that just keep revisiting and revisiting and revisiting, deepening conceptual understanding, but kids really aren't master of anything until, you know, maybe 5 years down the road, 3 years down the road. Or we can just say today's lesson is multiplication. You do this, and there's no understanding whatsoever. Kids are just going through the motions. And so within the standards, I will tell you that we have expectations for 3 aspects of math. We kind of call these 3 legs of the stool. So 1, we have to pay attention to conceptual understanding. We have to tell kids what math means, how to explain it, what it represents, drawing pictures. My daughter, we went out to dinner the day she passed her last multiplication drill. And it makes me sound like such a mean mother when I say these things in public. But so that night we were at dinner in this celebration, and I said to her, so Ariana, if someone was going to ask you, like, what does multiplication mean? Or when would you use it? What would you say? She didn't have an answer. She had no understanding of the concept of multiplication. She could tell me her facts, but she didn't have an understanding of the concept. And so even though great that she knew it, that wasn't going to serve her well if she didn't understand it. So we really need to invest the time to develop conceptual understanding, as well as procedural skill and fluency. And then finally, kids also need to know how to apply their math. So my great example for this one, my kid mom example, is Ariana was doing her division work, you know, days and days of worksheets coming home for homework with division. So I remember she brought home the worksheet, and I forget what the heading was in the middle of the page, but all these division problems, and then on the bottom of the page there was a problem that read this. The fire alarm rang at 2:48. The fire truck arrived at 2:57. How much time did it take for the truck to get there? And she came to me and said, Mom, I don't understand this problem. So I repeated it. The truck arrived at 2:48. The bell rang at 2:48. The truck arrived at 2:57. How long did it take to get there? And she just looked at me. I don't get it. So of course I got a little frustrated, probably read it again a little louder. Take a deep breath. I try not to do that. And finally she said to me, I don't get what this has to do with division, Mom. And this is an idea that we really set our kids up for, right? This is a kid who didn't know how to apply math because she just said, this week we're doing division, Mom. That's what we do. And didn't know how division applied to that problem. And so how often in life when we have to use math, is there a heading? This is a multiplication problem. This is a division problem. So that idea on an assessment in a real life situation where a kid has to know their math with enough confidence that when not prompted in any way, they know what to do. This is what it means to be able to apply math. And it turns out the way you get good at math application, conceptual understanding, and procedural skill and fluency. We still need to expose kids often to these application problems. It's actually quite a motivator for kids, but this is the way we get kids better. So this is a worksheet that I promise, whether you all want to admit it or not, exists in your schools right now. So place value is really an important skill, K2, really important. So I can only imagine how many teachers give their kids worksheets like this and say, boy, I am a good teacher. 100% place value, big concept. You get this right, 100%, I'm moving on. And can we all agree that this is not a place value worksheet? You don't have to know a darn thing about place value to get 100%, or maybe you'll get the one that has 67. You might get that one wrong, but come on, you'd move on anyway if kids just got one wrong. You don't have to actually know anything about place value to get this right. But yet we're doing this all the time because we don't have a whole lot of great resources out there for conceptual understanding. Very different than if I give a kid a set of problems like this. Right? If you can do this, you probably do know something or other about place value. Now, one of the reasons why I like to show this is because one of my fears in life is that we all think that Common Core math means every problem starts with a 3-paragraph narrative describing a problem. It'll take 3 days to solve. Like, actually, this is Common Core as well. Here's another one. Write a number that is greater than a fifth, less than a fourth. When given to a group of adults, 37% responded, there is no such number. Because we know what to do, right? Well, do I find common denominators? Do I least common multiple? What? We don't understand the concept. We don't pay attention to that typically in our math curriculum. And that's actually what you're looking for when you're asking for the answer to this question. Now, when it comes to this idea of procedural skill and fluency, it is true that within the standards, there are certain things that kids need to know with speed and accuracy. It's back. So 3rd grade, you'll see the example that I've touched on more than once today. Multiply, actually, and divide within 100. By the end of the year, this isn't a September goal. The idea is kids have done enough problem solving, enough experiences, understand the concepts well enough, have been so familiar with these processes that by the end of the year, there is a degree of automaticity that they have with this math. In kindergarten, you're talking about adding and subtracting within 5. So you can imagine by the end of the year in kindergarten, you can pull a kid out in the hallway and say, hey, what's 2 plus 2? And just like they know their name, they can give you the answer. And then you take a look at all these expectations, and this isn't kind of secret sauce, by the way. Like in the standards itself, it says fluently multiply and divide. You know, it gives you that information within the standards. In 5th grade, the fluency expectation is multi-digit multiplication. So you can imagine that by the end of 5th grade, you can pull a 5th grader out in the hallway and say, what's 172 multiplied by 483? And it is not the case that their eyes roll in the back of their head and they kind of do all these crazy tricks and they can spit out the answer. But what it means that they are fluent in multi-digit multiplication is that when presented with that problem, they don't start crying, they don't start sweating, they don't start trembling, but that they have a strategy that they can rely on that will give them an accurate answer with a degree of speed. 20 kids could have 20 different strategies, but by the end of the year, all kids should kind of have in their back pocket a strategy to do these things. When my mom started teaching 3rd grade about 3 or 4 years ago, I guess now that she went to that grade level, I remember her asking me, Sandra, back to school night, do you think it's okay if I tell the parents that I'm going to expect the kids to know their multiplication facts? I said, I don't know, Mom. Are you going to tell them they need to know their alphabet also? Like, we just right away say it's too hard. But if kids don't have these fluencies in math, it's really hard to go on to the next step in math. But it's amazing how many things we've kind of, with this maybe, you know, we won't admit how much we believe that math is hard for our kids, and we don't push kids in math the way we would push them in literacy, for example. A kid can't read in 3rd grade? Oh my gosh. They can't add and subtract in 3rd grade? Must not come from good genes. It turns out, not unlike complex text, the way you get good at math, you do math. Okay, so I would be remiss if in talking about math, I didn't also talk about the mathematical practice standards. Like, how great are these statements? Who wouldn't want to talk about things like, make sense of problems and persevere in solving them, model with mathematics, use appropriate tools strategically. I will tell you that this is the one thing that got our organization most activated to talk to districts about implementation. Because what a lot of districts were doing, and you don't have to raise your hand if this applies to you, is they were saying, you know what, our teachers are really stressed about all these literacy expectations. So with math, we're not really going to worry about all the changes in content expectations. We're going to start with the math practices. Because right now we're doing too many worksheets, and we want kids to do more problem solving in math, so that's going to be our push with Common Core Math. We're just going to work on the math practices. And so if you can imagine our description of the starting case, which was a mile-wide, inch-deep curriculum, and you're telling teachers to be nice to them, you're going to take that mile-wide, inch-deep curriculum and turn it into, what? A mile-wide, mile-deep curriculum. It's like, thanks for that. Impossible. You actually would be better off not even starting the standards at all if your first move is to start with these practice standards. What should your first move be? Focus. Has to be. Power of the eraser over power of the pen, or you can't do any of this. You can't have these rich experiences in math if you have a topic every week. Like, who could do that, right? So first you have to figure out what your major areas are, and there's resources on our website that give additional information for that, and then you can do these. The other danger in the use of these math practices is this bureaucratization, which is actually, again, one of those things that would be funny if it wasn't true. So school districts who have done things like Problem Solving Mondays, Perseverance Tuesdays, Strategic Tool Wednesdays, not the move. Not the move. Actually, there are some schools who thought this was the way that they were going to get all the stuff that came out of the math curriculum back in their curriculum. So for example, we took out patterns in early elementary. No more patterns. Turns out that's not math. In the state of New Jersey, I was telling the story last night with the parents, it was almost the straw that broke the camel's back in New Jersey that we took out patterns. I had math professors throughout the state calling me and saying, you can't do it. Kids will not be able to get to algebra if you take patterns out of early elementary. My mom tells me all the time, but Sandra, kids like that. It's fun. They're good at it. Not a reason to do it, right? Not a reason to do it. And it turns out, so when this was all happening in the heat of the moment, I called Jason Zimba, the person who led the math work, and I said, Jason, what do I tell this math professor who's telling me kids need patterns? He said, tell them to look at the research. The only topic that US is #1 in the world in is patterns. Not #1 in the world in algebra. Case closed, right? Like, we really just need to move on. Okay, so here's what I want to tell you. I have become increasingly adverse to this idea that what we all need is Common Core training. Okay? It's not a new tool, it's not a new piece of technology. It's not that, as much as I know you all have learned a tremendous amount in this hour together, you are not trained in Common Core. This is about professional learning. This doesn't stop at the end of a workshop. This is something that kind of has just now signaled a path that you should all go on. And so in order to continue to go on that path, you need to continue to learn, continue to give the teachers with whom you work opportunities to learn, and know that there are incredible people doing incredible work around this across the country right now. If you're not already signed up to the Park Online website and updates and have seen the sample tasks and the things that they are developing, like, you are missing out, because that work is actually targeted to being informative to all of you. And there are a lot of things out there in order to help you. So, a couple of those things. We have a Twitter handle. We don't use it often, but you'll also notice when you go on our website at Achieve the Core, we don't have a lot of stuff on our website. So when a really great article comes out, like the New York Times editorial last weekend, in full support of the Common Core, things that you might need in your own communities, interesting research updates on the Common Core, and so on, we use Twitter to give people updates about that. So if you haven't kind of gotten into that realm of social media, I would encourage you to do that. Second thing is achievethecore.org, which is our website. And I list there, and you have it in your handout, all of the things that I would look for if I were you in that website. So the first thing is this conversation around the shifts. There's a lot of tools, a lot of essays there to support this. We even have a template to make a little business card, two-sided, with the shifts that you can give to your faculty so they can always have them in their pocket. We were going to do temporary tattoos, but thought that was a bit too much. So business cards instead. Second thing we have that is absolutely intended to be useful to you is that we've developed a series of professional development modules. And so what these modules look like is that they are PowerPoints with as many notes as possible. So literally the way we do this is pretend we're presenting, and other than the jokes and the examples about our kids, write everything in the notes section and put that in the PD module. We also have a blank page in case sometimes people say, hey, can I have a copy of your slides? And you don't want to tell them that you had the notes for every little thing you said. So there's a blank one also without the notes. If you want to send people that one, that's fine. There's activities in each of these PD modules that you can do with your faculty, PLCs. There's videos out there that can support this work. All things intended to help you do this work. We have them, 2 of them on the math shifts. We have the literacy shifts, literacy in the content area, a PD module on writing text-based questions, instructional leadership in the Common Core, making the case for these standards, some of the stuff that I opened up with, for example, how to talk to parents about the Common Core. Part of the slides that I used last night in my presentation to Oak Park, took right from there. And we continue to do this as we go. And so this is intended to be useful to you, and I would encourage you all, either in your own self-learning or in the responsibilities that you have back in your schools and districts, to take a look at these. And when you look at our website, you'll find all of these things in a section of our website that is called Steal These Tools. You do not have to tell anybody that you got it from us. Can you imagine going to your superintendent and saying, so, over the weekend I was just thinking about this text-based question thing. Thought I might do a little workshop. That is perfectly fine with us. It is one of the reasons why our templates are so clean. Our website has nothing fancy, is because you should imagine your logo on this thing, your school colors. Do whatever you want with it. You don't have to attribute it to us, unless you want to, and you can do that as well. But that's the idea behind all of this. We have about a dozen or so close reading exemplars, which are short texts from about upper elementary school through 12th grade that literally show how you can do one of these close reading exercises with your class. So the one we started with was the Gettysburg Address, and it's really a 5-day, it is a scripted kind of, here are the questions you would ask, here's the vocabulary, but I will tell you that a misuse, 2 misuses I would warn you about with these close reading exemplars. If I were to show you a video of a teacher teaching one of these lessons, never in a million years would you think, boy, I guess that's what you need to wear when you're doing the Common Core. And I guess that's the instructional classroom management strategy of teaching the Common Core. And you'd right away make decisions about what of that example you'd change and what about that example you would keep. And when people are reading these close reading exemplars, what's happening is that they're thinking that what that means is Common Core is saying scripted lessons for teachers. It is not. These are just paper examples that teachers should feel free to discuss, figure out what would work, what wouldn't work, and so on. The other warning about the close reading exemplars is that they are not the work of typical teachers. It takes us months to develop each one of these close reading exemplars. So I wouldn't want teachers to, look at these and say, wow, this is what my unit plan needs to look like. People have said we've spent more time on these exemplars than publishers typically spend on an entire series. I mean, it is that close work to be done. The other thing, the areas of focus in math, very important. It's like having inside information because this was work that was done in the design of the PARCC assessments. At the cluster level in math, we've categorized all the clusters from K through 8 as either green, meaning they are major work of the grade, blue, which means they are a little bit less important, but important in the sense that they support the major work of the grade, like the standard, for example, that we looked at, and yellow, which are the things that are in the standards, but they will not be emphasized on the assessment, and if kids don't get to them, it is not going to prohibit them from progressing the following year in math. And so that's in a document called Areas of Focus. Absolutely, when you're making the decisions about what to cut out of your curriculum, I would take a look at that document first. I mentioned already the Basel Alignment Project and the Anthology Alignment Project with the questions out there. You can find that on our website. And really exciting work we have around the publisher's criteria. So as I said, we decided right away that we weren't going to write the textbook series, the curriculum that anybody would want in order to do this. But we care a lot about changing the marketplace. And there are many people who tell me all the time, like, yeah, good luck with that. So what we decided is that this is actually a two-sided problem. On the one hand, we need producers to be making better things. But very real and very critical to this challenge is that we need purchasers to know what quality looks like and only buy good things. Because it turns out, if you buy it, they'll make it. And when we go and meet with Pearson, Scholastic, and we meet with all of them, they tell us things, believe it or not, like, hey, listen, we would love to make good textbooks. Turns out that's not what people want to buy. And that's what they use as an excuse. So we created these criteria to give to purchasers and to publishers to say, if you truly are Common Core aligned, we don't want you to put a sticker on your book. We want these things to be true about your resources. It's kind of a narrative description of the standards as well. And so I would encourage you all to have your teachers read it. The PD modules that are coming out in the next couple of weeks or so, we'll have PD modules about understanding the publisher's criteria as well. They're about 15-page long documents, but a great source of information to support the standards. Actually, I should have updated the slide because the instructional practice evidence guides are on our website as of yesterday. And what these are, very exciting. So let me be clear. They are not intended for summative evaluation of teachers, but they are short, about 2 to 3 page long, but about 5 big questions, 3 to 5 big questions, that if you were going to walk into a classroom and want to know whether or not Common Core was being implemented, here are some questions to look for. Here are some things to look for. So it's an evidence guide intended for self-reflection, peer reflection, coaching, but not the summative accountability because our teachers aren't ready yet. We can't do that to teachers right now, but they need to know what it looks like. And so we have these evidence guides for K2, 3-5, and 6-12 ELA, and so far just K8 math, but the 9-12 is coming. It probably won't be that different than 9-12 math, so I'd go ahead and take a look at the K8 one if you only have high school within your school district, but these are going to be really helpful. And we think these will inform more summative judgments of teacher practice down the road, but for right now, they are just intended to give us good data about this. So just really quickly, this is the order that we typically do things in education. We get ready for an initiative, we throw at teachers all the stuff. That's what they want. They want stuff, so we just give it to them. And then the last thing we do is we think, so what is this initiative about? What are the goals that we're aiming for here? And so what I'm telling you is that things aren't quite ready for consumption yet. Publishers are still working at this stuff, so now is the time that teachers need to get smart at what these expectations are. Think about our goals, think about our targets, spend time really understanding what the standards are, and then we can make good decisions about what's out there and what's not quite yet out there. So we often tell people, buy time, not books right now. That's the investment that we should all be making, and I would encourage you all to think about that. So just in closing, in my observations around the country, these are the things that make people leaders in this work. Many of you probably have been working in systems like this already, and you will be fine. But the things that make a difference is, one, schools who see themselves as a system. This isn't something that you do, Common Core implementation, in addition to everything else that's going on. But you find ways to connect this work to the other things that are already going on in your school. You see this as a system. You have benchmark assessments, you figure out how that supports Common Core. All of your activities, you figure out how to make this seamless and integrated into the work that you're already doing. Second thing is that truly you're a learning organization and you make space and time not just for kids to think, but for the teachers to think as well. Adults to think, principals to think. learn. Parents are learning. Support staff is learning. As we're going on, makes critical progress possible. And then, of course, no surprise, hopefully from me, is that you really need to know what these expectations are. You really need to know, not just a crosswalk, not just an alignment issue, but really know in your gut what we are going for here and whether or not that's happening in your school. So that's all I have for you. And we have a quick announcement before you are dismissed. So hold on just 1 second.
Thank you, Sandra. It's now time for a break. Just want to let you know there's 3 sets of bathrooms. We have staff outside. They can help you find them. We also have coffee, juice, bagels, and dessert left in the cafeteria, so please help yourself. We'll be started at 10:45 with Susie's presentation and an excellent panel. See you in a little bit.
Thank you.
Oh, absolutely.
Well done. Thanks.